Good evening, everyone. I don't want to keep our audience or our wonderful panelists waiting much longer, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being patient. We were just making sure our tech was all good, and sometimes that takes a little bit of time, but we're all good. Happy to be here. Thank you all for tuning in on this lovely and chilly Wednesday evening. My name is Chloe Green. I am the Public Programs and Outreach Manager here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And I'm very excited to welcome you all to today's Emancipation Day celebration program. And with me, I have our VP of Education and Engagement, David Armenti. He's a champion. We love him, appreciate him. He's a man. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to him, and we're going to kick off this wonderful celebration. So take it away, David.
Thanks so much, Chloe. And I think, the words that you used are really poignant in terms of celebrating, also commemorating. And, we'll have the opportunity to get into why this day is so important, particularly for us here in Maryland. But I am really privileged and honored to be sharing the stage again with a few of my colleagues here. Who I will briefly introduce, but you'll also be able to see their more full bios in the chat. So we are going to be in conversation today with Maya Davis, who is the director of the Riversdale House Museum in Prince George's County, among many other roles and contributions that she's made to the field, but somebody that I've had the pleasure of working with for over a decade now and learning a lot from, especially within this area, particularly in our time at the Maryland State Archives. So thank you so much for being with us here this evening, Maya.
Thank you, David.
And also Marcus Nix, who as well is a very distinguished guest here, who is the new like a boxing champ here, assistant director of the Silas Craft Collegians program of Howard Community College in Howard County, Maryland. So another colleague that I've had the pleasure of working with for several years, and learning and having many of these types of conversations behind the scenes and also in public. So it's just awesome to really get all of these incredible voices together, especially on a day like today. So again, today being Maryland Emancipation Day, we really want to focus on our local context here in Maryland, but also make connections to the national story that some folks within the room or in the public at large might be a little bit more familiar with. So in the spirit of that, we want to kind of set the stage with some definitions and some understandings of what emancipation means and how that was actually applied in different parts of the country. So I was hoping I could start with you, Maya, and talk about, the foundations of emancipation during the Civil War period. And maybe we could start with what was the Emancipation Proclamation itself, and why did that not apply in Maryland, leading to the need for some of the later legislation that we'll talk about.
Thank you, David. As I think about emancipation, I think about the many decades of self-emancipation that enslaved people did leading up to this momentous event in our history, in our state's history, in our national history. From the very first incident of enslaved Africans coming into the colony of Maryland, you have enslaved people attempting to self-emancipate. And that carries forward all the way up into the outbreak of the Civil War, and it's even more heightened in the 19th century. And what we're looking at is a flame. Some of our more powerful voices that we know today, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, Henry Highland Garnet, and people like that, they are calling for emancipation in a world that is deeply entrenched and eat, sleep, breathe slavery here in this continent. So leading up to it, you have people that are asking for emancipation, and very specifically, Frederick Douglass writes about it in his own newspaper, the Douglass Monthly, that Maryland, it's about time that the state in which he hailed from actually freed its slaves. So Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, it only covered for emancipation in states in rebellion against the Union. And that's where we kind of see the deficit for the enslaved held within Maryland. And being at my site at Riversdale, I've been researching over the last couple of years and trying to come in touch with what our context is in discussing the ramifications of slavery and then eventual freedom. One of the third proprietor of our house, Charles Benedict Calvert, was a slaveholding male, a representative from the state, so have heavily leaning towards political leadership, and not only in the county but the state. He's in Prince George's County, hailing from a family. A name like Calvert rings far and wide here. They are the proprietors of the state. So when you are descended from people who are the decision makers on us being a colony for religious tolerance, and also a colony that held enslaved people, you come into this world knowing of slavery and being a part of the system that keeps people held in bondage. And so he actually dies before we get to the point of emancipation, but he's writing to President Abraham Lincoln on behalf of slaveholding individuals in Prince George's County. And so it's very telling leading up to emancipation, what the mindset is in a county like Prince George's, and very divided across the state.
Absolutely. Thank you for that context. And I'll be asking questions, but of course I welcome Marcus and Maya to just interject and bounce off of each other's points, which I know we'll have that opportunity through the course of the conversation this evening. But kind of, adding on to that concept of the context in Maryland and what made our situation unique here in the state, Marcus, I'm wondering if you could talk about that diversity of experience within enslavement, perhaps even within the boundaries of Maryland, and how that experience really varied across even from county to county. Even adjacent counties might have a different situation and even different political views on how this played out. So if you could tell us a bit about that nuance and diversity.
Sure thing. Well, thank you, David. And I think when you say the words nuance and diversity, I think that those are two words that definitely are relevant to how we can imagine the scope and the landscape of enslavement throughout the state of Maryland. On the eve of the Civil War by 1860, you have the free Black population and the enslaved population being closer than the other border states: Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee. Most of Maryland's congressmen, U.S. senators, and governors either owned enslaved beings or were sympathizers with the institution. And so when we look at the scope of Maryland, I think that the statement when it said Maryland is kind of like America in miniature, I think that it definitely has a lot of ramifications politically, socially, and agriculturally. So if we break it down, we could look at, for instance, Southern Maryland, the heavy tobacco growing entities having the highest numbers of enslavement. When we look at Anne Arundel County, Montgomery, Prince George's County, Calvert, Charles, St. Mary's, and so on and so forth. And then the Eastern Shore counties, Dorchester, Kent, Queen Anne's, Talbot, also having a diversified agricultural makeup and having enslaved numbers there as well too. But we find that things are a little bit different if we go a little bit north. If we push a little bit north and go into the Baltimore region, then we'll discover that things are not the same as they are in the South. In fact, the abolitionist activity gets heightened as it gets closer to the Pennsylvania region. We also see, and Dr. John Hope Franklin, a scholar, historian in his own right, said even by 1810, the free Black population in Baltimore was second to none and was the highest in all of the land in the nation. And we see geographically, and we can, and as Maya mentioned, the likes of Harriet Tubman, for example, it was easier for those who wanted to escape and find their way to freedom to get to Pennsylvania and get to Delaware and get to places to find their way to freedom. So when we look at the scope of Maryland, it was very diverse, very nuanced, very complicated, even the diversity of work. So the range of work that the enslaved might indulge in could range from ironwork or carpentry, blacksmith work, domestic duties. Frederick Douglass in his writings talks about how things were on a Talbot County plantation versus when he went to the inner city of Baltimore, and the scope that he did, going from plantation-based history to being able to get to a point where he could hire his work out as part of the task system. And then he would go on to be pretty instrumental in developing his skill set and his acumen on ships in the maritime industry as a caulker and in that sort. We see the diversity not only in agriculture, the diversity not only in the political scope. There's books, that always talk about how Maryland was a house divided. Maryland was a house divided. So, of course, there was Confederate sympathizers and Confederate ideologies that were pervasive. However, even in Howard County, even in my own home county, the Union trained there, the Confederates trained there. So it wasn't as black and white. It was still very mixed. It was still very scrambled. And we even find that even the types of resistance varied as well, too. And when we talk about the resistance, and as Maya said, self-emancipation. And I believe it's important to talk about the agency, that these enslaved individuals had from day one, whether it was negotiating the terms of their freedom, or whether it was absconding through waterways or absconding through rivers and boats. And a great book that speaks to that is the one that I have here in my hand, Sailing to Freedom: Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad. So the Chesapeake history and the Patapsco and waterways and railroads, all of these things were conduits that could aid and assist those who were enslaved to find themselves to freedom. But once again, when it came to forms of resistance, literacy through education, and we know that, education was something that was banned, just like we see today, in many instances and in many ways. Poison of the slave master, arson, and so once again, the nuance and the complexity is there. And Maryland is definitely, as it is an upper, right below the Mason-Dixon line, and considered a state of the upper South. It did have a pro-slave sentiment. However, we also do find abolitionist activity, and we do find geographically that things didn't look the same everywhere. And so that nuance helps us to have a more comprehensive, clear scope of how we can imagine enslavement of the past in Maryland.
Absolutely. And I think something that both of you are alluding to is even, those that did decide to self-emancipate, having the vision, having the not just the foresight, but even being able to imagine freedom was something that Frederick Douglass in Talbot County, maybe not so much, but once he got that glimpse of it in Maryland, that changed. And in a place like Prince George's County that was really steeped in that tobacco economy culture and had probably the largest enslaved population, maybe even with the proximity to DC, there was maybe less opportunity or less vision at that time. But acknowledging that self-emancipation is so important, and giving that agency as you mentioned. So, working forward from there, the Emancipation Proclamation has been passed, has been ratified. The war is still ongoing, and political divisions in Maryland are still really hot, going into late 1863, 1864. What How do we get to the emancipation in Maryland? What are some of the kind of what is the legal step that takes place? Maya, could you tell us a little bit more about kind of the mechanics of how that played out in Maryland, now that we know the context?
Well, we just barely got there. It's one of those things where, I mean, by the skin of our teeth, we reached emancipation. And really, it was attributed to those soldiers who actually sent their votes home, those absentee votes, as we will call them today. Um, like it was really a majority that were against the Constitution of 1864, which would emancipate enslaved individuals. When those votes came in from the soldiers that had served in the Union, um, I'm sure many of them may have actually voted against this Constitution if they had not at times served beside the enslaved individuals who had also formerly enslaved. There's free Blacks, there's formerly enslaved people, some who were serving on behalf of their owners, some who had actually fled to Union armies. And, it's one of those things where I've seen it time and time again where you have a military leader writing about the ways in which and the formerly enslaved were serving in the Union and like how admirable they were and willing to go to battle even more so than their own. And so it was really telling what people saw. And so I think that greatly impacted, the votes that came home in favor of the Constitution. And then the other side of it is, there are those people who did not want to secede from the Union. There is that as well that played out in favor of emancipation, but it was a very narrow margin. I think just under 2,000 is the count difference, and actually the difference between emancipation or not in the state of Maryland.
Yeah, and again, I think there's definitely an assumption, and not to take away from the significance of the Emancipation Proclamation, but an assumption that was a sweeping and broad impact that changed things right away. And yes, it did initiate some major change, but it was incremental beyond that, to get to the point where a state like Maryland could more officially declare that slavery wasn't going to exist anymore. And the language actually says that hereafter in the state there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except in punishment of crime. And there are stipulations on that, and we can get into what the practical situation was. But again, understanding that not everybody was on board with staying within the Union or seceding, and that would be reflected within this vote and the really tight referendum within that Maya mentioned.
It is so true. When you think about the laws and policies that lead up to emancipation and those that come after, you think about all the individuals who were arrested as runaways or assisting with flight, which includes, of course, free Black people. Those are all people who have committed a crime ahead of emancipation. And so they would continue to live a life of servitude, and it would take a county level, request for them to be pardoned. And that was largely up to either a local representative in the General Assembly or the governor. So that is very complex, and even leading afterwards, that's when you start to see, I always tell people the moment enslaved people are free, whether that's through escape or emancipation or manumission, however you call it, it is the moment that people are threatened. And so policies in Maryland start to take shape. Every little incident related to people being being threatened by Blackness. These people now have like a little bit of, or what is perceived as power. And that's a threat to whiteness in Maryland. So you see a lot of the law shaping. And then, after emancipation, one of the things that has quickly changed that people are required to work. You can't give the appearance that you're sitting around and you're not making an honest living for yourself. And then you're just laying around. So let's kind of sign you up for an apprenticeship. And so you see a lot of apprenticeships start to show up in 1865, 1866 across the state, and forced apprenticeships. This is not a choice. Many parents have had their children taken away from them through the apprenticeship system. And it's really a continuation of a system. And then, of course, as you know, serving on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation, racial violence is on the rise after this, and we do see the increase of racial terror lynchings within our state as a result of this action.
And I'll say this as well. There's a book called The War Before the War by Andrew Del Banco, which really speaks to, when we talk about, the Emancipation, Civil War, and what happens thereafter. Well, there already had been a number of efforts to minimize and reduce and limit Black freedom, going to the Underground Railroad and those camp examples. And in those cases, Maryland by 1832, the American Colonization Society, was thinking about, well, okay, if these people taste freedom, well, not here, they're going to have to go to Liberia, or we're going to ship them out to Haiti, or send them up to Canada, or send them somewhere else. So, and so I think that's also important to mention as well too. So when we talk about emancipation and things like that, to help us have more context, how did we get here? The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and all of those types of things definitely, I would say, create a collision course that get us to this moment. And so there's a lot of things that definitely happening, but at the same time, we still see that agency right there front and center, looking at the Black print movement. Maya mentioned the rise of abolitionist activity, Black press, newspapers, pamphlets, David Walker, taking pamphlets, Black nationalist literature and liberatory writings and actually putting them in the coats of the piece of the clothing he tailored, and sending them down south, so that way those on the plantation could engage with it, and next thing you know, uprisings and things taking place. So there's a whole lot of things that led us to get to this point. And so I think it's also important to look at how we got to emancipation as well too, just as much as we look at what happened afterwards. So
absolutely. And I'm seeing a lot of great activity within the chat. And thank you, Chloe, for reminding that we would like to see those questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to address as many of them as we can as we get toward the end of our hour together. But a few things that I picked up on in the last couple of comments, certainly understanding that backlash, right, to freedom, whether that be racial terror violence in the form of lynching, but also against some of those former United States colored troops that were coming back into what they thought were their home communities and where they wanted to, make their place again, and facing violence, not just from former Confederates that came back, from just from other white community members who didn't appreciate the assertiveness that they were showing at that time. And I think another thing we need to remember, alongside the distinction with the Emancipation Proclamation, is that formal Reconstruction did not take place in Maryland in the same way that it did in the former states in rebellion, the former Confederate states. So some of the protections were not necessarily there, despite the fact that we were in close proximity to Washington, D.C. So would definitely welcome any additional thoughts about what those protections were, but also what were some of the challenges that folks were facing in these communities post-emancipation, and how they dealt with them.
Well, I'll say this, and I'll even give you all a shout out, David, Maryland Center for History and Culture. I have here um, the Constitution here that was signed, Charles Carroll, and that might be a glare on here because of the light. But when we talk about how James Baldwin says in his classic quote, "History is not the past, it's the present. We carry our history with us." So laws and decisions that were made and acts that were done, it has a residual effect and it shows up. So what I showed was, the signing of the Declaration of Independence here. We have Charles Carroll, one of the signers. He in Howard County had one of the largest plantations, Reagan Manor, and we see here a slave inventory of the individuals that he owned. And so we see that residual wealth. We see the economics. I came across an article the other day that was even speaking to how there's still, I guess, some debate and some controversy over whether Maryland Emancipation Day should be considered a holiday in the way that others are, where people don't have to work, people can have a day off to recognize and commemorate. And one of the concerns was, if we do it, there's the potential reality of losing money, of losing funds. And so when I came across that in the article, I had to scratch my head and say, so what about the decades of enslavement and how those individuals who were enslaved under the oppressive thumb of enslavement, what about their reparations and what about what they're owed? And even we see in history, 1862, Washington, D.C., there were enslavers who did file claims. And there were enslavers who did get their compensation, so to speak. But the other thing, too, that I'll mention as well is when we talk about the transition from enslavement to freedom, it wasn't just a clear-cut transition. We find that, as it's been said, the scholar historian Rayford Logan speaks to, the nadir and then the lowest point of race relations that followed emancipation. So when we talk about what that looked like for some Black folk, whether they migrated and left and set up all Black towns, or whether they stayed put and stayed local in where they were, we find the domestic terrorism. We see that there's lynching that takes place, social deference and voting disenfranchisement, and the burning down of schools, and minstrel shows being a huge moneymaker, and all across the country. So once again, this notion of Black goals. We're supposed to have emancipation, but why am I harassed and intimidated when I vote? We're supposed to be, free, but why can I not live where I choose to live? We're supposed to be emancipated and free, but I still can't get a correct, equitable education or have the resources that I need. So once again, there's still that. And then also what I would also say is the historic trauma that comes from it all. So you can remove the shackles from somebody's wrists and you can remove the shackles from someone's ankles. But when a group of people, have been beat, have been raped, have been, slaughtered, when they've been demeaned and dehumanized, that just doesn't go away. And so when we think about Maryland Emancipation Day, there's space to celebrate and there's space to commemorate. But it's also important to really, also think about those who had to suffer at the hands of the heinous acts that unfortunately we still see to this day.
I'll just piggyback on Marcus. One of the most groundbreaking books that I read for me in my work is that by Jim Downs, Sick from Freedom. Oftentimes we look at emancipation as this celebratory moment, which, today I think it is something worthy of celebration. But if you're living in 1864 in Maryland, you understand, what people have and what they don't have. And, if you've only lived a life in servitude, you don't know anything else. And so you're now set with trying to figure your life out. Union camps are running rampant with illness. Many people don't have basic necessities. I mean, things like shoes. Frederick Douglass often writes about how children, in many instances, did not have shoes, most adults. And so, I think about what that looked like and the fact that some people were able to overcome because there was a lot of death that occurred following emancipation. Not everyone survived emancipation. Some people actually were still tied to their former plantations, to continue working in servitude roles. So it's not this big glamorous picture that we think. We see the images, I think, a lot from like 1875, which is like 11 years later. And it looks like this big parade, and they show the images of Baltimore, and as Marcus shared, Baltimore already has a free Black community. So these are people who are able to celebrate in a way, and it's not the story across the state. If you live in a place like Prince George's County, which is very Southern leaning. It is the heartbeat, I think, of 19th century enslavement. Like you said, it's the largest population prior to emancipation. And so very Southern leaning tendencies. You're not going to see the same level of celebration at that time period as you see in Baltimore, in places like Baltimore. On the Eastern Shore, it's about 50-50 enslaved to free Blacks prior to emancipation. So you are seeing a community that people are able to go into, which I think is very different for counties in Southern Maryland, like Prince George's, Calvert, St. Mary's, where enslaved people are the core of how they've been able to survive. And so it's not something that you're even allowed post-emancipation to really celebrate in that way. It's years later before you see an emancipation celebration in places like Laurel and in Prince George's County. It's a very different situation, as Marcus laid out. It's very different across the state. But illness is just something I think we need to pay attention to, and thinking about children. One of the descendants from the Georgetown Memory Project said, slavery is all about the children, because that's the moment that you can indoctrinate people. And, that sat with me, because then I thought about the number of people who were actually coming out of a system, the only system that they ever knew, and having to figure life out. It just really is heartbreaking to think about. But somehow here we are, Marcus and I, both descendants of enslaved people, a testament to that survival.
And if I may, I think that there's that survival. I know me on a personal level, it's very inspirational. When I think about some of the stories and different things that happen, one of the things that come to my attention is the work of Dr. Heather Andrea Williams in this book here called "Help Me to Find My People," the African American search for family lost in slavery. So family reunions and people out in pursuit of their lost loved ones, and ways how they tried to heal grief, and tried to mend and rebuild those relationships from separation, from enslavement and loss. So that is something I think about as well too. We look at also the proliferation of Black education from HBCUs sprouting up, even though, to be very clear, Institute of Colored Youth in 1836, Chan University is established before the emancipation. We do see that bridge and carryover. And James Anderson, in his work, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935, speaks about, the fact, well, hold on here. Even after emancipation, these Black folks who go into the political scene, these Black folks who are teachers and who are creating these safe spaces, these colored schools, well, they first got their literacy, or first began to engage with certain levels of literacy under the oppressive thumb of enslavement. And so once again, I would even posit that spirit of community, that spirit of family, those cultural values and those cultural ties, as harsh as it had been, it also served as a protecting mechanism. It also preserved as an agent to be able to support each other through mutual aid, to protect each other amidst some of the harshest realities. So one of the things that oftentimes happen is creating those safe spaces. And I think that I always, am inspired by seeing the examples of community that were there. In fact, oftentimes the free blacks and the enslaved, well, a lot of times, depending on where you were, it was hard to decipher who was who. In fact, they wanted to at times keep the enslaved away from the free people, because if the enslaved was close to the free people, that might incite in the mind of the enslaved people, hey, maybe I ought to pursue, stealing the boat and paddling my way to freedom. Or maybe I ought to think about disguising myself and jumping in the wagon of hay and getting on up yonder. So I would even argue that even how we imagine the data and the statistics, even that might not be as simplistic and cut and dry as you might like to think as well, too.
For sure. And, touching on a few of those points as we kind of are approaching our last 15 minutes here. And, both of you have already kind of displayed your research chops and some of the various primary and secondary sources that you draw from. But, what you, Marcus, and Maya both mentioned was that element of community and, trying to maintain those bonds within a family, within a community, and what that meant for survival, but also that connection. And we were going to talk about this anyway, but the question had come up in the chat about slave statistics, about some of the other data and documentation that went into that. And I should mention, in Maryland, we're also particularly rich in primary source material between our various archives and repositories that many of us have spent a lot of our time in. But Maya, could you talk to us a little bit about that documentation, and particularly with slave statistics? What was the purpose of that, and maybe what were some of the indirect results of that, perhaps in the genealogical realm?
Okay, so the Maryland slave statistics, they were provided for by the Maryland General Assembly in 1867, and signed off, of course, by the governor. The governor would appoint a county commissioner for slave statistics to every county in the state of Maryland. So they can record the names of individuals who had been enslaved as of November 1st, 1864, when emancipation took place. Of course, 1867, many of the enslaved owners would have died off by that time. But they would have had like an executor to handle their estate. Like you're looking at a lot of people who had a number of slaves. Not that Maryland was a big plantation state, but it did have a couple of large plantations in its state. But we're looking at small farm economy here in Maryland. And so it was up to people to go back and then, fill out this information in an effort to be compensated for the loss of enslaved labor. As we have, it's such a taboo topic to talk about reparations in 2023 and years prior, but systematically with every war from Revolutionary War to Civil War, including the War of 1812 in between, white people have been compensated for the loss of enslaved labor. And so it really is that set of records. It's a bittersweet taste for me because, here people are attempting to profit yet again after generations have profited off of enslaved individuals, and the nerve to come back in 1867 and want more. But not they don't get compensated. Those Marylanders who were compensated were the Marylanders who had actually gone to Washington, D.C. and actually had put their slaves on those lists. You do see a couple of people from Maryland on those lists in Washington, D.C., but Marylanders do not receive that compensation. What I do find to be a benefit of the slave statistics is many times people hit a brick wall when they are looking for their enslaved families. And I feel like the detail in which Marylanders record free Black people, because of course these people at that point are going to be free, they provide a lot more information when they know it. And so while, a lot of people say in other states, I can't find it, like there's a trillion Jims, a trillion Henrys, a trillion Marias, and these individuals have surnames that kind of help you figure out a family's lineage. And they tell their age, their gender, whether they actually served in the military on behalf of their owner, what their physical condition is. And so you start to rebuild who these people are, and look at, you know, physical attributes, and in a hope that you can kind of gain some personal connection to these individuals who have been silenced through history. But the Maryland Slave Statistics, they're a great resource. I saw that Marlena Giroux was in the comments, and she did put in there that not everyone put their name on this list, which you do see absences and voids on the slave statistics, but there's still a number of individuals who were actually on this list, and it is a very great resource.
Well, I would just say that one of the things that Maya just said that definitely caught me. Many things she said caught me, but the nerve to still ask for more. And you know what I think about is the psychological aspect of this. So we talked about the economic with the statistics and the reparations and stuff like that, but you know, and this is the last of the sources that I'll show. I don't even know if these things could be seen with the glare, but this is John Eager Howard, who is the what Howard County is named after, and he's giving in this image here his wife Martha a flower, and so he was an enslaver as well too. And the thing that I think about when I see images and primary sources like this, it's like, okay, he had the capacity to feel, he had the capacity to love and to humanize his wife, to give her the plant or the flower, whatever it is, to be romantic, to be able to, I guess, sweep her off her feet, or however you want to look at it. But then where does that energy go to those who he enslaved? And in order for him to do that, you know, there's this cognitive dissonance that has to ensue, where you have to dehumanize an individual or a group of people to justify or to manage your own discomfort and dis-ease. And we see that take place even to this very day. In 2023, all across the country, the policing of the circulation of ideas in terms of humanizing Black history, teaching Black history, you know, certain Black history programs being denied. And so the denial, how can you have some nerve? Well, because you're removing the emotions and the feelings out of it, at least I believe. And I think in order to grapple with this history, and once again, in order to be able to celebrate Maryland Emancipation Day, I think we also have to do some emotional work and deal with our feelings, because a lot of times the hard history that we talk about, we get numb. You know, it's not easy to deal with these stories, but I believe when we talk about the nuance and the complexity, that makes the history more rich. And I think it could also be a tool to bring us closer together, addressing the truth. So
thank you so much for that. And I think it's an important message to, as we kind of move into our Q&A portion, is that education is not, the purpose of education is not to shame or whitewash history, although of course there's plenty of shame to go around when it comes to some of these topics, depending on whose perspective you're coming from. But the point is truth telling, so that we learn and we can grow and hopefully, you know, build something better together moving forward. So all of us, I think, are connected to institutions that are really dedicated to learning and not covering up history, but showing it in its full good, bad, and ugly, so we can move on and learn from it. And I'll also mention, you know, Marcus, that individual you showed, John Eager Howard, the land that the Maryland Center for History and Culture is on was, I believe, bequeathed to the city of Baltimore, that by John Eager Howard and his family, and that ultimately were the grounds that our archives and museum are sitting on. So, you know, that history, that place-based history, you know, especially in a place like Maryland, you can feel it, see it, and learn about it in a bunch of different contexts. So as we're coming here into our last 10 minutes, we want to address some of the questions that have been coming in from the public, and thank you so much for for your engagement in that respect. And we, in addition to what's in the Q&A, if we have time, we'll try to sift back through the chat and see if anything else came through there. Christy Williams had asked if we could speak to the role of slave statistics in finding ancestors and what were enslavers offered. So we did address that question to an extent, and perhaps in our follow-up, we can also share some links to where individuals in Maryland can find those slave statistics, which I believe are cataloged with the Maryland State Archives. And I'll take this next question. Are there any discussions about reparations happening at the state level in Maryland? We've mentioned compensation to former enslavers, and we've mentioned efforts to retrieve family members, but do we know kind of in practice if that has been requested from the legislature, or what conversations have happened around that?
Well, David, now it's been 2.5 years since I worked for the state, so I don't engage on that level as much anymore. But at the time that I was the legislative liaison for the state archives, there was in 2020 a bill put forth related to reparations by then Delegate Juanita Fisher, who's now councilwoman in Prince George's County. And that bill, as you know, like many other bills, was paused and pretty much put on hold to support the efforts of the pandemic and relief for Maryland citizens. So I don't know where that conversation has gone since that time, since 2020, if it ever came back up in any subsequent sessions after that. But Delegate Juanita Fisher did have a bill. And so it is part of the conversation, and she was a very active member of the Maryland Legislative Black Caucus. So I'm certain there's conversations around it. Where it sits at this point, I really can't say.
And I don't have anything on that. My response would definitely be better than mine and could offer more than I could on that. So,
in that vein of kind of the larger umbrella of reconciliation, Maya, you alluded to the commission that we both sit on, the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we do, to some extent want to credit the state of Maryland for putting itself out there. That's a unique and first of its kind body looking at reconciliation and recommendations for those victims of racial terror lynching. And while that's not nearly on the scale of enslavement in the state of Maryland, it is a component of how we try to address these historical wrongs that kind of aligns with hopefully what the state's message is and what we feel is important in our communities here.
And David, I'll just piggyback on that and just say it's November 1st. There's no time like the present. We have a session coming up in January. Maybe this is the time that people take action and revisit this conversation with the General Assembly, because now is the moment, not in January when they've already got their agenda set. Now is the moment to start reaching out to your local representatives and across the state to have this discussion about talking about reparations, because there's no bill passed that I know of related to individuals getting reparations in the state of Maryland.
And there's another question here that I think I know the answer to, but I'm not 100% sure. Has there been is there a state holiday for Emancipation Day, or is there any effort on the legislative side to get that created?
So there is a state holiday. It's not one with a day off. Then former Delegate Jolene Ivey from Prince George's County introduced that legislation into the General Assembly. I think it might have been like 2018. And it was written into law to be a state holiday, but it is one where they expected citizens across the state of Maryland to become educated about Emancipation Day, and do more work within our schools to impact the curriculum around learning about Emancipation Day.
Do we know if there were any celebrations of Emancipation Day, particularly in the late 1800s in Maryland communities? Have either of you come across that in your research?
Oh, for sure. I'm sorry, I don't want to hog up from Marcus. I see Marcus over there. He's on mute, but Nace Hawkins Day on Talbot County was a huge day. The later celebrations in Laurel, Maryland, were pretty significant, but then also those that took place in Baltimore City. Just 2 weeks after emancipation, Frederick Douglass comes back to celebrate emancipation in Maryland. So Baltimore City is probably one of the earliest celebrations that there is. And then, you have to think about like how people identify when you look at places like Prince George's County, which we talked about being like on the close proximity to Washington, D.C. That's kind of my area where I live and grew up. So many of those individuals have more association by these false boundaries with Washington, D.C. So, D.C. emancipation is something else that's celebrated as well. So while there were people who were likely enslaved in Prince George's County, many of them did go into Washington, D.C. to celebrate D.C. emancipation, which is like April 16th. So, it varies, but there are celebrations in the late 1900s, 1800s, I'm sorry.
Yep, definitely. And I think that I mean it was laid out well right there. And I would say I would think that would be why these conversations are so important to have, and why we should keep generating awareness about this. We see Juneteenth now being out there. Now that comes with a day off, and there's a lot of talk about that. But once again, localizing the story and relating it to a lot of where we all are. So there could be more celebrations and more recognizing. Um, and as I always say, as we do it, maybe not polarize or romanticize, but let's humanize.
Absolutely. And it was mentioned some of the kind of specific commemorations that took place. One of the things I just dropped in the chat was the speech that Frederick Douglass had at Bethel Church in Baltimore. Just a little over 2 weeks after Emancipation Day in 1864. And you think about that, that's just a pretty incredible fact in and of itself, that this was the first time that he had returned, um, particularly as a free man, and not having to worry about being recaptured. Although, of course, he had his he had been sponsored and paid for by folks before 1864 to ensure that he wasn't legally a fugitive slave anymore. But I definitely encourage folks to check that out. It's got a lot of really incredible messaging, and we know what a great orator and speaker Frederick Douglass was, but also what Maryland meant to him. It was hard for him to not have been here for 26 years because of those circumstances, not seeing family members and things along those lines. Why does Emancipation Day not get the same attention as Juneteenth? Marcus, what do you think?
Well, I think I think when you think about Juneteenth, um, you I think that one perspective and way you can imagine it is a national story, going all the way down to Galveston, Texas, Granger, and all and those being told at Ashton Villa, you're freed, and then the celebration thereafter. Um, and then there's Lincoln and how we imagine Lincoln and all of his nuances and all of his complexities. But when we think about Maryland, Maryland is its own state, with its own uniqueness. And I think even where we are now, and I've discovered this working in a local museum. Shout out to Mr. Nat Alston who tuned in today to our session. I discovered that there's a growing appetite and a hunger and an interest to grapple with local history. And I know that also the monuments are a part of the discussion. But I think that, hey, there's just more of an interest or more emphasis now because of where we're at. How do we localize these stories? How do we make them more relatable? How do we connect them? Even with Frederick Douglass, Frederick Douglass, Talbot County, many of us don't know his story as well. But, as one who's from Howard County, one who grew up in Howard County, was raised in Howard County, taught in the public school system of Howard County, currently live and work in Howard County, I was really inspired by the work of a lesser known figure. And this is a little bit more closer to home, Oliver Cromwell Gilbert, who was a gentleman who, he is in a Western Howard County plantation, Walnut Grove, Richland, and he ends up at a campfire meeting, finds his way to freedom, and he escapes, and he becomes a orator like Douglass, a musician, a teacher, an abolitionist, and he comes back on his horse. And once again, in front of his enslaver, showing that agency, showing his ability to overcome, showing his ability to navigate and maneuver his way to freedom. And so Douglas is Maryland, but however, Carmel Gilbert is right in my backyard. So once again, I'm saying all that to say, I think with this Maryland recognition, I think it's side by side with just a growing interest in local history, engaging with that, and being at a local museum, and I know Maya's probably observed and bared witness to it too. The intimacy in the way that we can engage with these conversations and these kind of discussions and these kind of topics, I think also matters as well too. So that's what I would say to that.
And David, if I could, before we go, I was just going to say that I remember, I think it was Senator Ellis, Arthur Ellis from Charles County, who in 2020 attempted to get Maryland Emancipation Day as a state recognized holiday that would be a day off for employees. But again, that fell in within that 2020 timeframe that everything was canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So all of those legislative bills kind of fell by the wayside, and here we are in 2023, and I don't know that there was an attempt to bring them back up.
Well, that's as good a way as any to wrap us up with that call to action, so that we can not only do all of our own part in continuing the education, continuing to build the visibility of Emancipation Day alongside national initiatives and holidays like Juneteenth to make sure that we are all acknowledging, learning from, and finding ways to commemorate these important pieces of history. So I just want to personally thank Maya Davis and Marcus Nix for joining us, Chloe Green for pulling this all together with us. But we really, really appreciate your perspectives and spending time with us this evening.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. And before we hop off, I'll just say this program has been recorded, so it will be posted to our virtual program archive in a few weeks, which the link for that has gone out in a follow-up email for everybody who registered. Personally, thank you, Marcus and Maya, for joining. It was really wonderful to meet y'all, and hopefully we'll get to chat soon. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. And yeah, please, everybody stay warm. Enjoy the fall season. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation, and we will hopefully see you all at our next virtual event, or you come visit us on site, or you can pay Maya a visit and PG. You can pay Marcus a visit, or you can pay Marcus to come to you, whatever your style is.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. You all have a wonderful evening and take care.
Good night.